Hey, it's Alex from Way Back History. I want to preface this video by saying that this is current through October 24th of 2020. At some point I'm going to release a follow-up, but I wanted to at least post this right now because this war in the Caucasus, which broke out in late September, has been getting some play in social media and other places. However, a lot of the reporting of this conflict being shared is oftentimes emanating from the mouthpieces of each of the combatants and not from a neutral source. And the international media does not have a lot of representation on the ground, which makes it difficult to sift through the information coming from one side or the other to ascertain the facts on the ground. But there are enough sources on the ground to where a neutral view of the conflict can be created and mapped. So today I wanted to use the apolitical world map to take an unbiased and neutral look at this ongoing war in the Caucasus. Now, we covered the history of most of the would-be conflict zone in the background portion of our video on the Iran crisis, as the Caucasus nations gained their independence, battled against Turkish, British, and Russian aggression in the context of World War I, including the Armenian genocide, before eventually being incorporated into the Soviet Union. The internal borders of the Soviet Union were later drawn by Stalin for the purposes of weakening the Caucasus republics, attempting to ethnically divide them and increase their reliance on Moscow. This would also keep the countries weak in the future if they ever attempted to break away from the Soviet Union. However, by 1988, the Soviet state itself was coming under internal threat as the country's reforms were not progressing and the hungry populace was losing faith. Nowhere was this more pronounced than in the Caucasus, where pogroms took place in 1988. After back-and-forth ethnic clashes and skirmishes in the early spring, on February 27th, rallies and protests turned into pogroms against the Armenian populace of Sumgait, with Armenian inhabitants killed or exiled. For the Armenians, this brought up memories of the Armenian genocide, and the clashes would continue in September. Stepanakert, one of the main centers of this tension. The pogroms saw the expulsion of the Azeri population from Stepanakert, while the nearby Shusha saw the expulsion of its Armenian population. While only one person was killed, a 61-year-old Armenian, the tension, expulsions, and violence were only escalating until the Central Soviet state intervened on September 21st, only after 3 days of beatings, arsons, and, as mentioned, expulsions. The Soviets imposed military order. However, the Moscow-imposed order, which had reigned over the Caucasus for decades, was on its last legs, and it now effectively took martial law and curfews to enforce the peace. Should the Soviet state collapse, war seemed almost inevitable. By late 1991, that was a reality. The way the region had been divided by the Soviets was designed to weaken the inhabitants, as mentioned earlier. However, in the effort to keep the Soviet state together, even the reformer Mikhail Gorbachev would use this to his advantage. In 1988, Gorbachev and the Supreme Soviet denied the request from the Armenian SSR to incorporate the majority Armenian Autonomous Republic of Nagorno-Karabakh, or the Mountainous Karabakh, an ethnic enclave within the Azerbaijan SSR, into the Armenian Republic. The denial to merge Nagorno-Karabakh into Armenia set off protests in Yerevan, which were quelled by Soviet troops. Further complicating the geography of the matter was the Nakhchivan Autonomous Republic, also part of the Azerbaijan SSR, but although I don't have it illustrated on this map, was actually separated from the rest of the Azerbaijan territory, including Nagorno-Karabakh, by a small Armenian corridor. But it was Nagorno-Karabakh and Stepanakert, the capital of the Autonomous Republic, that would become the focal point of what would turn into the First Nagorno-Karabakh War, which I'll just briefly touch on as part of our background information. On November 26, 1991, the Nagorno-Karabakh Autonomous Republic was dissolved by the Supreme Soviet of the Azerbaijan SSR. Stepanakert's autonomy was taken away, and in anticipation of Azerbaijani independence, something that had already been declared by Azerbaijani politicians at this point, the majority Christian Armenian population was now set to be folded into an independent Muslim-majority state. There was fear amongst the ethnic Armenian population of Stepanakert and Nagorno-Karabakh that the pogroms and ethnic cleansing could be coming should that be the long-term result. and as such they were completely against any proposal to become a part of an independent Azerbaijan. Therefore, on December 10th, authorities in Stepanakert proclaimed the Nagorno-Karabakh Republic. At this point, it was de facto a new republic of the USSR, effectively a 16th, or if you count Transnistria, which was doing the exact same thing at this time, a 17th republic of the USSR. Thus, in the mind of Stepanakert, it was on a path to its own independence separate from that of Azerbaijan, and it was willing to fight to get it. In the meantime, that looked all the more likely, as Soviet internal troops began leaving the region and the Soviet army began a withdrawal from the Caucasus region due to the pending independence of most of the members, including both Azerbaijan and Armenia. Nagorno-Karabakh, despite never having any representation at the national level within the Soviet state, was pursuing that path as well, with support from Armenia and against the wishes of Azerbaijan. Both the Armenian and Azeri factions were led by former communist apparatchiks turned capitalist, including the Aliyev family that still leads Azerbaijan today. On the 25th of December, Gorbachev recognized it was over. He resigned as president of the Soviet Union, and the Supreme Soviet in Moscow voted to dissolve itself, ending the country's existence and immediately legitimizing the previous declarations of independence by its member states. With the breakup of the USSR, we now get a better view of exactly how complicated the situation was in terms of ethnic enclaves and exclaves. And remember, there was a significant population in most of these areas of the opposite faction, that is, the minority group not in control of the area. These populations were at the greatest risk as war threatened to break out in late 1991. Because the former autonomous republic was a complete enclave of Azerbaijan, the independent Nagorno-Karabakh was now suddenly surrounded by 100% enemy territory as Azerbaijan launched a blockade to fully cut off supplies in what it viewed as its rightful territory, which is technically recognized by Armenia as Azeri territory. Nevertheless, Azerbaijan began shelling Stepanakert, and the first civilian casualties of what would become a 2.5-year war began. Armenia, working in conduit with the Nagorno-Karabakh forces, attempted to capture the town of Lachin, and along with it a mountain corridor, which represented the closest and easiest connection between Armenia and Stepanakert, in an effort to relieve the beleaguered city, which again was only seeing the start of several years of war. Meanwhile, it was completely cut off from supplies due to the Azeri blockade until the Lachin corridor was opened. Once this was secure, Armenia began to seize the other border areas, which were majority Azeri populated, and in a reverse of what the Armenian civilians in Nagorno-Karabakh feared, the Azerbaijani civilians in these surrounding regions found themselves subject to ethnic cleansing, at least effectively, as they fled following the defeat of their army. And so the grievances on both sides ran deep. By May of 1994, the appetite for more warfare and death was no longer prevalent, and a ceasefire was enacted, although no peace deal, by both sides meaning Armenia and Azerbaijan, as neither party recognized Nagorno-Karabakh, including Armenia. As such, the rest of the world followed suit, and Nagorno-Karabakh struggles for international relations outside of its informal diplomatic and military ties to Armenia. Because of this, the situation is ossified, and Nagorno-Karabakh has effectively become an extension of Armenia, or a client state. For the first 14 years after the ceasefire, most of the front lines were abandoned. In fact, the mountainous northern front line was essentially completely abandoned by both sides. However, since 2008, occasional low-intensity hostilities have broken out for never more than a few days at a time. The first of these occurrences was March 4th of 2008. Against a backdrop of civil unrest in Armenia, forces apparently clashed around Mardikert, with the story of the battle and also the number of injuries and casualties disputed by both sides. In early 2010, shooting broke out along the northern front line of the mountains, where 3 Azerbaijani soldiers were killed. Later that year in June, another skirmish broke out in Mardikert. Armenia and Nagorno-Karabakh lost 4 troops in the engagement, while Azerbaijan lost 2. Just under 2 years later, in 2012, a series of skirmishes led up to an Azeri attempt to push into the Nagorno-Karabakh Republic near the city of Horadiz. Nagorno-Karabakh forces succeeded in repelling the attack, but they did suffer 1 casualty. In the summer of 2014, more clashes began around Mardikert, as in the first weeks of August, A combined 18 soldiers of each side were killed. Later that year, on November 12th, an Armenian attack helicopter was shot down by Azerbaijani forces near the front line. The helicopter crashed with all 3 crewmen killed. The Azeri explanation was that the helicopter had deviated across the 5-kilometer-wide informal exclusion zone honored by the two sides along the front line. In April of 2016, the most explosive fighting in over 20 years broke out all along the front line, effectively a border war between Azerbaijan and the Nagorno-Karabakh Republic, and by proxy Armenia. However, Russia, fellow Orthodox Christian to the Armenians, still maintained a base in that country and has an official military alliance with the Armenians. However, it does not recognize Nagorno-Karabakh, as Armenia doesn't either. Unlike Armenia, Russia does not provide any direct support for Nagorno-Karabakh. That being said, as I mentioned off the top of the video, the borders were obviously drawn in a way which was meant to advantage Russia and to keep them in control of the region. And the existence of Nagorno-Karabakh is advantageous to Moscow for that reason, even if its support is indirect, thus brokering a ceasefire to keep the status quo in place, while at the same time promising the Armenians total support against Azerbaijan should Armenian territory proper be attacked. However, that's another example of just pitting the two against each other, because at the same time Russia was going over the head of Armenia, and Nagorno-Karabakh for that matter, to get Azerbaijan to agree to peace, and as such, Russia got to keep calling the shots in the region. Despite 4 days of the deadliest fighting in over 22 years, the front lines did not change in any notable way. On February 20th of 2017, the constitutional referendum was passed in Nagorno-Karabakh. The mountainous Armenian enclave also approved a name change in the referendum, with the country's name itself being changed. The Stepanakert government would now represent the Republic of Artsakh. In 2018, more clashes began near Gunut, near the no man's land at the north end of Nakhichevan, which had been a front line during the early 90s war. Both sides took small casualties in the conflict, which died down at the end of May. In July 2020, skirmishes began to develop not along the border between Artsakh and Azerbaijan, but, like the 2018 clashes, along one of the frozen front lines from the full-on Armenian-Azerbaijani war from the early 90s, that is, along the Armenian-Azerbaijan state border itself. These skirmishes would develop into larger artillery bombardments, and eventually both sides began launching drone strikes against each other's command posts. On the 14th, Azeri Major General Polat Hashimov was killed by strikes from either Armenian or Artsakh forces. Immediately, protests erupted in Baku over the death of one of the nation's highest-profile generals. The protests were backed by the Aliyev government, and in fact, the protesters were so riled up that they actually attempted to enter the parliament building in Baku with demands of retaliation against Armenia and Artsakh. However, the July skirmishes would in fact come to an end rather quickly after several other officers on both sides were killed in drone strikes. And this finally brings us to the current war, which began on September 27th of 2020. Wide-scale fighting broke out along the entire border of Artsakh and Azerbaijan, the once quiet front lines by now heavily remilitarized by both sides, and as fighting commenced, effectively open battle between Artsakh and Azerbaijani forces began, with Armenia indirectly supporting Artsakh. The commencement of hostilities saw the first bombing of Stepanakert since 1994, since which time the city had been entirely rebuilt after being reduced to a heap of rubble in the early 90s. However, the bombs began to rain again, and by the next day, Armenian forces were striking back, bombing the Azeri city of Tartar near the front lines. By September 28th, the second day of the conflict, martial law had been declared in all three entities, Armenia, Artsakh, and Azerbaijan. Numerous media and civil restrictions were announced as well, and Armenia and Artsakh announced their total military mobilization. Azerbaijan also announced partial military mobilization. All three countries were mobilizing for war. But in the meantime, the intense fighting was already underway in many sectors, including the village of Nuzgar along the river Aras near the Iranian border. Azeri forces would capture the village on September 28th. Both ammunition and drones passed into Iranian airspace and was shot down, this coming from both sides in the fighting. Meanwhile, the Azeris opened up a second front in the mountains to the north as they attempted to seize the town of Talish. They successfully advanced into Talish and other villages near nearby by September 29th. And also on that day, both the principal powers, Armenia and Azerbaijan, claimed that the opponents had used rockets and fighter jets along the direct Armenian-Azerbaijan border, which had increasingly been subject to skirmishes in the last 4 or 5 years. Fighting in these sectors began and escalated quickly, at least in terms of force. Later that day, an Armenian fighter jet was downed, with the Armenian Ministry of Defense accusing the Turkish Air Force of shooting it down, as Armenia claims the jet was downed by an F-16, which Azerbaijan's Air Force does not possess. Both Turkey and Azerbaijan have denied this, and for the most part I'm going to stay away from claims that have yet to be verified by third-party sources, but this particular claim got a lot of play in the media, and so it can't be ignored, despite the fact that we have really no way of verifying this. Shelling continued by both sides as they continued to accuse each other of hostilities on September 30th. On October 2nd, renewed bombing campaigns began, with both sides engaging in the heavy use of rockets and fighter bombers against cities, with once again Stepanakert and Tartar trading off, playing the victim. In Stepanakert, thousands of civilians began to evacuate, and other ethnic Armenians from Karabakh began to evacuate from the countryside as well. A further bombing of Stepanakert took place on October 4th, and in return, the Artsakh Air Force retaliated by bombing the city of Ganja, the second largest city in Azerbaijan behind Baku. Artsakh claimed to have only attacked the military airport in Ganja, which is connected to the civilian airport, while Azerbaijan claimed that no part of the airport was hit and only civilian blocks were hit by the bombs, with civilians killed. Azerbaijan would respond by questioning the military legitimacy of the operation, saying that neither airport was touched and only civilian areas had been bombed. Third-party sources show a large range of bombed targets in Ganja, a city that, like Stepanakert, was not done being targeted in this conflict. Later that day, Azerbaijan claimed to have severely wounded the president of Artsakh as he was visiting the front lines. However, this was denied by his office, and later he made a public appearance to prove it false himself. Despite this, he had been at the front lines, so it's possible there was a close call, although again, the lack of evidence makes it difficult to say. One of the cities that used to be part of Azerbaijan surrounding the Nagorno-Karabakh Autonomous Republic was Jebrail, a city completely abandoned by its Azerbaijani population once the Armenians had taken control of it in 1993 and 94. The city is called Drakan in Armenian. However, it was not rebuilt or repopulated and effectively is a ghost town. Nonetheless, it remains an incredibly important propaganda piece, along with other cities in the areas surrounding the former autonomous district, all of which are ghost towns formerly populated by Azeris, along the Aras River and the border with Iran. After Aliyev had declared that all of Jebrail was in Azerbaijani hands on October 4th, Artsakh the next day announced a retreat from positions east of the ghost town. The next day, third-party sources did confirm the Azeri advance to the outskirts of Jebrail, although it was in fact until October 9th until they had the city entirely in their control, with some of the most intense fighting of the nascent war occurring amidst the ruins. Meanwhile, in Armenia proper, the National Security Service tightened the martial law and warned against, quote, propaganda aimed at disruption of the defense capacity of the country, with more national security legislation enhanced as well. At the same time, both sides were accused of either hiring mercenaries or working with vigilantes from other countries. Azerbaijan accused, of course, of working with Turkey, as I mentioned earlier, but also with hiring forces from their puppet state in Syria, the Syrian interim government in the northern third of what used to be Syria, while the Christians of Artsakh were accused of seeking help from Greece, and of course their effective sponsor is Armenia, despite Armenia's official political distancing with Artsakh. With the conflict raging and having turned into a full war, diplomatic talks commenced in Moscow, with Russia wanting to put the lid on the conflict and, again, keep the status quo in place, the status quo that benefits Russia. However, in this case, it's not Russia going rogue. Russia actually has the backing up of France and America as part of the OSCE Minsk Group's solution to this conflict, and like many conflicts in the Caucasus, Russia is effectively the guarantor of peace and stability in terms of the great powers, with the exception of Turkey, which has officially come out on Azerbaijan's side, despite denying its possible military assistance to Baku. After 10 plus hours of talks, at 4 in the morning on October 10th, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov announced a ceasefire. Prisoner exchanges and Red Cross recovery efforts were supposed to commence and take effect at noon, with the cessation of hostilities. Although these talks and ceasefire were seen as a bit of a prelude to more serious talks. However, the point was effectively moot because the ceasefire never commenced. Both before and during the time when the ceasefire took effect, both sides accused each other of breaking the ceasefire around the area of Hadrut, Azerbaijan's next target in the south, which effectively led to both sides ignoring the ceasefire and just continuing to fight. By 11 p.m., the ceasefire had been completely broken by both sides, and as Artsakh accused Azerbaijani forces of bombing Stepanakert, the Azeris responded by providing proof of shelling in Tartar and Ganja once again. On the same day, Armenia also launched a missile attack at Ganja from the territory of Armenia proper, from the town of Burg. This action is effectively bypassing the step of using Artsakh as a proxy and shows the nature of what effectively has become a direct war between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Armenia claimed that the missile attack was supposed to take out a hydroelectric power station, but third-party reporting also demonstrated that it killed 10 civilians. The bombing is in effect strategic. It appears to be retaliation for the repeated bombing of Stepanakert. 2 days later, the battle for Hadrut was mostly decided as Azerbaijan seized control of the strategic heights. Armenia, which still held much of the urban portion of the city, attempted to counterattack. The city of Varanda, known to the Azeris as Fuzuli, was also easily accessed from the heights around Hadrut. In an effort to pinch off the city, Azerbaijan also seized villages to the east of the town. Meanwhile, over the next couple of days, the battle for Hadrut was coming to an end as Azerbaijan gained complete control of the city. Although not acknowledging specifics, at this point the president of Artsakh, despite defying the rumors about his health, had to confirm that Artsakh had suffered several defeats in the field. Shelling, bombing, and the accusatory back and forth that goes along with it expanded to the northern mountainous front line, the Murovdog sector. This effectively meant that Artsakh was fighting along its entire front with Azerbaijan. As the Azeri advance continued, Azerbaijan's state security service warned about the possibility of terrorist and sabotage attacks in places of large gathering or public transport in Baku and especially Ganja, effectively a renewed tightening of the martial law and media restrictions in place. By the 16th, Azerbaijan had gained full control of Hadrut and was now eyeing Fuzuli to the east. Meanwhile, Azerbaijan continued to advance along the river Aras from Jebrail, capturing several more villages in this area as well. On the 17th, Russia asked all sides to respect the agreed-upon ceasefire and to again negotiate upon the basis of the status quo. Azerbaijan, frustrated by 25 years of what it considers to be Russian protection of Artsakh, which of course Azerbaijan views as its own territory, and in fact is recognized as such by both Armenia and Russia, was having none of it, and declared a Russian member of parliament who had been visiting Artsakh in recent days to be a persona non grata in Azerbaijan. This, along with Turkey's full support for Baku in this conflict, is an example of how Azerbaijan could be falling out of the Russian sphere of influence should Moscow not succeed in restoring the status quo. On the 17th, Azerbaijan suspended its public transport in several major cities, including Baku, and the Baku metro was suspended through November 2nd. Meanwhile, the fighting just continued to intensify. Armenian Scud missiles again hit civilian areas of Ganja, killing 10 more civilians. Azerbaijan responded by again bombing and shelling Stepanakert, a city which is becoming close to as abandoned as it was in 1993, prior to the original ceasefire, not to mention the damage along those same lines. Also on the 17th, Azerbaijan forces were confirmed to have captured the city the Armenians call Varanda and Azerbaijanis call Fuzuli. Azerbaijan had now captured significant territories in the more open regions of the south, and Russia, still hoping for the opportunity to put the genie back in the bottle, got the sides to agree to a second ceasefire, and now a body exchange would be set up. However, once again, this didn't hold, And in fact, in the morning, Azerbaijan launched an entire offensive along the Iranian border, advancing down the river Aras. Meanwhile, in the north, along the direct border between Armenia and Azerbaijan, Armenia launched new attacks at Azeri positions as Armenia edged closer to direct involvement. Meanwhile, the Azerbaijani advance into the southern portions of the Republic of Artsakh continued, with the Azeris capturing villages between Jebrail and the Iranian border. On the 21st, again, opposite accusations of shelling were levied against each side for the bombings of Mardikert and Tartar, respectively. Meanwhile, also on October 21st, Azerbaijan continued its offensive in the south, making a push towards Zangilan, known under Artsakh control as Kovsakan in Armenian. Later that day, after intense fighting, Azeri forces captured the city and posted a video of its forces inside the now surrendered and abandoned Artsakh military headquarters in the town. A second prong of this offensive was launched to the northwest towards the town of Kashunik, known to the Azeris as Kubalu. By the 22nd, Azerbaijani forces were on the outskirts and had captured several villages surrounding Kubalu. Around noontime on that day, Azerbaijan claimed to have shot down an Armenian drone flying over its exclave of Nakhchivan. This claim, however, is unconfirmed, and as of yet the war is yet to spread to Nakhchivan at this point, as it did back in the 1990s war. Later in the day, Aliyev announced that Azeri forces had captured Agband, the last village before the Armenian border, although third-party reporting only confirmed that the Azeris were outside the village at the end of the day. Intense fighting also continued in the areas around Kashunik. Agabad, the abandoned former Azeri village on the Artsakh border with Armenia, finally fell to Azeri forces on October 23rd. The Azeris also created a third prong in their advance to the north as they attempted to spread their forces out over the entire southern basin between the mountains south of Stepanakert and the river Aras at the Iranian border. As the Azerbaijanis continued to fight towards a second point at the Armenian border near Kashunik, which would effectively cut off the entire southwestern swath of the Republic of Artsakh, Azeri attacks have also been launched not just on the ground to the north, but through shelling and missiles to the north in the direction of Lachin, which, as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, is the most convenient and most direct corridor of Armenian support and supply to Stepanakert. Seems like this important mountain corridor could be the next target for Azerbaijan, which to this point has conquered around 20% of Artsakh's territory. It's unknown what Azerbaijan's final goal of this war is, whether it's a limited victory or perhaps rolling back the entire Republic of Artsakh. And likewise, Armenia and Artsakh's plans are not known, nor is it known whether Armenia would coordinate with Artsakh more closely should Stepanakert come under increased threat. Already thousands of refugees from the Republic of Artsakh have been accepted into Armenia, and the question over what Azerbaijan does and how Armenia responds to it appears to be the question that will define the outcome of this war. With outright war having been raging for nearly a full month now, America, which had been represented, again interestingly enough, through Russia in this instance, began to take stock for itself of the situation. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo met with the foreign ministers of Armenia and Azerbaijan, as, like Artsakh's patrons in Armenia, America doesn't recognize the Stepanakert government, with Pompeo emphasizing the need to, quote, end the violence and protect civilians. Despite this sentiment from virtually all the great powers, with the exception of Turkey, this has proven difficult as the bloodshed has continued and the death toll amongst civilians and service members has grown. Over 100 civilians have been killed during the war, with nearly 400 injured. Meanwhile, on the military side, Armenia claims to have lost 927 soldiers so far, with Azerbaijan not disclosing their numbers, but it expected to be somewhere similar, and an estimated 90,000 civilians having been evacuated from the Republic of Artsakh, fleeing what could be the conquest of their homeland. Yet for Azerbaijan, the issue is one of fundamental territorial integrity. There's no question this is a serious and grave topic. With that said, it's incredibly important and interesting to take a look at and study as the world's borders and its geopolitics continue to evolve. This is effectively history in real time, and as morbid as it can sometimes be, it's sometimes really important to remind ourselves that this is the real world. This can happen at any time, and those who enjoy peace on a regular basis should be thankful beyond their imaginations. We will be back to cover this war and its conclusion. Tragic as it's been so far, and tragic as it may turn out. But for now, thanks for watching the channel. Make sure to subscribe for more content. I'm Alex. I'm out.